Alrighty, there are two more chapters in this 2017 anthology, Human Origins Contributions from Social Anthropology, that I would like to go through before I finish the series. I think the first five episodes in this can be taken as a kind of deeper analysis of what human culture really is, and by extension, what is humanity? What does it mean to really be human? I think since the fifth episode, when I started talking about ritual, and then we were talking about analogical reasoning and metaphor in the two following chapters, being episode 6 and 7, it gets a little bit more um, complex or elaborate. And so I would sort of consider that to be a storied continuation of the themes developed in the first five episodes. And so there are going to be two more chapters following from episodes 6 and 7 that detail the rest of what I want to explore in this series. And my reason for doing that is because I want to have done with human origins. So today we're going to be exploring an essay by a lady named Camilla Power. Camilla Power is senior lecturer in anthropology at University of East London, and her research focus is the evolutionary emergence of symbolic culture, with cross-disciplinary perspectives from biological and social anthropology. Fieldwork with the Hadza in Tanzania has explored gender ritual and women's culture. She's previously co-edited The Evolution of Culture with Robin Dunbar and Chris Knight and published numerous articles. And so I found her essay to be suggestive, interesting, fascinating, and again, it doesn't need to like it's an argument and it's argued based on anthropological evidence. And it doesn't need to be taken as gospel because the way that science works is by someone suggesting an argument and then other people criticizing it until they come up with a better argument. So, um, her conclusions are going to be as follows because I'm trying to orient you to what this ends up being about. So, the chapter is called Reconstructing a Source Cosmology for African Hunter-Gatherers. And so, the conclusion is spoilers, but this is to get people interested in what this may be about. Quote, while this is a preliminary and cursory attempt at comparative ethnography, a few conclusions can be drawn about the source of African cosmology. A, it was lunar and menstrual, in that ritual and practice around menstruation manifestly affected relationships between women, men, and the animals they hunted. Processes of production and reproduction were intertwined and showed this metaphoric equivalence. To menstruate is to shoot a poisoned arrow. To give birth is to kill large game. This conforms to the lunar menstrual character of the invariant syntax of myth described by Levi-Strauss. Okay, and I'm going to go into what all this means with reference to her essay, but I'm reading out the conclusions first. That was conclusion A. Conclusion B. Healing and spirit dances involved polyphonic singing performance, largely of female choruses, leading to euphoric or trance experiences through rhythmic repetition of sound and movement, invoking nebulous spirits of the dead or the forest. C. The potency of shamans or spirit dancers and menstrual maidens was one and the same power, capable of carrying the community into first creation. Gendered initiation groups represented origins scenarios through the reversal of sexual attributes and or species mutability. These motifs of reversal coincided with the switch of lunar phases, an oscillation between taboo and relaxation of taboo. A dynamic of reverse dominance allowed each gender group, but especially women, to assert egalitarian relations and mutual interdependency. Again, there's a lot here that we're going to unpack. And finally, D. Large horned antelope, like eland, supplied metaphors of transformation in initiation and healing dances, again predicated on the waxing and waning of the moon. The guardians and creators of these animals de passage impose respect rules for all game. These were effective supernatural sanctions governing the proper sharing of flesh. human and animal. And we're going to see how in the next chapter by Ian Watts, which I'm going to go into, these large horned antelope and the symbolism that derives from them are equivalent to the symbolism and meaning, I should say, associated with serpents. That seems like nonsensical, but we'll go into that later on. I'm now going to start those were the conclusions. I found it again extremely rich, evocative, fascinating, and let's get into it. So, reconstructing a source cosmology for African hunter-gatherers by Camilla Power. In this chapter, I explore the possibilities of reconstructing a source cosmology for African hunter-gatherers. Given what we now know about the deep history and relationships among populations, including Bushman groups, Western and Eastern Central African forest hunters, and East African groups, such as the Hadza, what are the implications for a comparative project on magico-religious beliefs? The idea that these groups are remnants of a formerly widespread Proto-Caucasian Pygmy Aboriginal population, argued in respect of the Bushmen by Tobias, has been challenged. But population genetics currently validates two key points. One, these populations all share ancestry with distinctive deep-time phylogenetic clades. And two, the time depth of separation among the populations reaches back into the Middle Stone Age to dates equal to or greater than the movement of modern humans outside Africa. That is in the order of 50 to 100,000 years ago. So basically, she's doing this comparison among the cosmological, like the worldview, the cosmology, the beliefs about these different cultural groups across Africa. And the idea of some kind of comparative project has been previously challenged, but she's drawing on new evidence from population genetics to argue that no, it's okay to do this kind of deep kind of comparison, and that approaching something like a source cosmology is actually something valid that we can attempt. So she goes on, African forager populations, Caucasian, Western and Eastern Pygmies, and Hadza, conserve the most ancient human lineages with the highest phylogenetic diversity. We can use these ancient haplotypes to trace population dispersals from southern across to East Africa. During marine isotope stage 5, the penultimate interglacial period, from 128,000 years ago. This is associated with the beginning of the mega droughts in Central Africa, also the time at which Homo sapiens becomes much more visible in the archaeological record. So again, she's focusing on a particular period of time, namely the penultimate interglacial period from around 128,000 years ago. This is associated with the beginning of drought in Central Asia and the movement of these ancient human lineages from Southern Africa to East Africa. So she goes on, while all populations show some admixture, African hunter-gatherers are differentiated between themselves and in comparison to other African populations. This suggests they represent geographically distinct populations, isolated over tens of thousands of years. Caucasian, Hadza, Sundaway, and Pygmy populations could indeed be remnants of a historically more widespread population of hunter-gatherers. Kalahari Caucasian groups show a deep time, 30,000 years, separation, corresponding to a northwest and southeast geographic divide. Pickrell and colleagues also substantiate shared Caucasian genetic sequences in Hadza and Sundaway East African click-speaking forager groups. According to Rita and colleagues, this ancient link in genomic data between Caucasian populations and East African populations could be a trace of the ancient migration, whereas the spread of click consonant languages was probably much more recent. Previously, a time depth of 15,000 years was suggested for Sandaway and Hadza separation, and in the order of 35 to 55,000 years, separation for Hadza from Bushman lineages. Western versus Eastern pygmy groups show separation at a time depth of over 20,000 years, coinciding with the late glacial maximum. While divergence between Bushman and Biaka, Western pygmy populations, with significant shared genetic material, could date back 100,000 years ago. Okay, that's the end of that paragraph. It was a bit complicated. She's essentially just saying, hey, we can compare all these different now isolated hunter-gatherer groups based on genetics to show that they stem from these source populations around 100,000 years ago or so, or more recently. So this is the kind of genetic background to the comparative cosmology that she's going to construct. So then she asks, in terms of shared cultural roots, what is the implication of ancient shared ancestry with deep time subsequent separation of populations? Each of these African hunter-gatherer populations bears a cultural heritage independent of the others over long time periods. If significant commonalities between magico-religious traditions were demonstrated, these could be of considerable antiquity, tracing back to source cosmologies contemporary with the emergence of modern human symbolic behavior. The most conservative aspects of cultural continuity, which potentially include archaic structures of ritual and cosmology, could therefore stem from the Middle Stone Age. So what she's saying is that these different groups, these different African hunter-gatherer populations, um, have such different cultural heritages that if we can draw out their similarities, that those similarities might be from an extremely long time ago. They might be some of the oldest, what did she say? Yeah, the most conservative aspects of cultural continuity. There's a way that by reconstructing uh, at least the elements of these different cultures that are shared from a similar area in the world, that we can hone in on what are like the oldest keys to cultural continuity among humans. That's the idea anyway. Okay, one more paragraph here. She says, from this perspective, a comparative ethnography of African hunter-gatherer ritual and myth could illuminate the archaeological record of early symbolism. In recent decades, with few exceptions, social anthropologists have abandoned grand unified theory in the style of Levi-Strauss or de Huche. In his exhaustive analysis of central Bantu epic cycles, The Drunken King, de Huche considers reconstituting earliest Bantu mythic complexes by analogy with linguistic reconstruction. Quote, structuralist method enables us to take a basic and decisive operation, that of laying bare the outlines of one of the greatest semiological complexes derived from this lost mythic kernel. Whatever that means. So she says, does our picture of hunter-gatherer deep history in Africa permit recovery of lost mythic kernels of African and therefore modern human cosmology? Can we pursue a kind of cultural cladistics, identifying shared derived characteristics likely to have belonged to ancestor populations? At the very least, can we constrain possible models for the emergence of symbolism by attention to such ethnographic detail? Essentially, she's just asking the same question. Can we do this kind of comparative cosmology among similar African hunter-gatherer groups usefully or gainfully? Okay, so now she goes into what is this hypothetical baseline culture? Like if we're saying that there's some kind of shared source population that these different cultural groups might derive from, and we're trying to characterize that source population in some way. That's what she's trying to do. It might help to imagine um, what the qualities or the particulars of such a source culture. And so this is the intention, I think, of her first section. That was all introduction, which is called a hypothetical baseline. It then goes into this lunar template model that she was talking about. But for now, a hypothetical baseline. So again, trying to draw out the qualities, characteristics of an original um, source population for these different cultural groups. She says, someone who has stepped in this direction is the musicologist, Victor Grauer. Aware of the recent population genetics findings, he starts by observing the close affinities of Pygmy and Bushman music, with their highly characteristic interlocking, hocketing, polyphonic singing styles. These appear to be shared cultural traits, despite the long-term effective separation of these populations. So what they're essentially saying here is that there are not only profound genetic similarities between these different, now culturally separate groups, but there are actually deep similarities in their musical and singing styles, or at least some similarities. Again, not to say that there aren't meaningful differences, of course, but she's focusing on the similarities for a reason. Grauer goes on to examine other traits found specifically among Bushmen and Eastern and Western Pygmy groups to build a picture of a hypothetical baseline culture for the source populations of present-day African hunter-gatherers. He describes his triangulation method as follows, quote, any distinctive tradition in the form of a value system, belief system, performance practice, behavior pattern, artifact, or attribute not likely to be the result of outside influence, found among at least three different groups, representing each of the three populations with the deepest genetic clades, may be regarded as a potential survival from an older tradition, traceable to the historical moment of earliest divergence, and thus ascribable to a hypothetical baseline culture. So what he's talking about is these, like, if we can find these traditions, distinctive traditions, that are common among three different populations that are very different in the present time, then they're likely to be from a shared common source. So now it gets specific, gives a table. But so Power says such shared traditions, he argues, are unlikely to have arisen from convergence in a similar environment or through mutual influence, given such long-term separation. And so Table 7.1 summarizes Grauer's list of traits proposed for the baseline culture, triangulating from Bushman groups and Western and Eastern Pygmy groups. Clearly, almost all these traits can also be found among the Hadza, as immediate return hunter-gatherers. I intend to bring the Hadza into this comparison to add force to Grauer's triangulation method. Okay, so what are the features that are in Table 7.1 that point to um, the traits proposed for this hypothetical, again, hypothetical baseline culture? Well, there are several, there's about 10. The first one is their vocal style, which is distinctively polyphonic. That they have a subsistence culture that involves hunting and gathering and use of honey. That their social organization is in the form of nomadic small bands. We don't know about their models of kinship, about their language, or about their location, apparently. We do know that their economics was, quote, communal, that their politics was, quote, acephalous, that they were of a short stature, that they used beehive huts, that they used spears, bows, arrows, and poison for weapons, that they used tools made of stone, bone, and wood, that their cultures involved use of ritual and religion that were proto-shamanistic, involving healing, trance, initiation, funerary rites, and healing techniques. They used a lot of body decoration, involving body paint and scarification. So there's egalitarianism, leveling of power dynamics and sharing of resources, relative equality between genders, and apparently a lot of cooperation, non-aggression, and conflict avoidance. Maybe a little political creeping in there, but I think that's a pretty solid summary of table 7.1. Now it briefly summarizes what is the relevance of Grower stuff, and then moves into the stuff about a lunar template. Okay. While Grower provides a reasonable starting point with several valid observations, some major aspects, including kinship, language, geographic location, and environment, remain unresolved. Here, Camilla Power, I should say, Camilla Power, aim to expand on the brief remarks Grower offers concerning religion or cosmology. First, though, I propose a significant addition to his list, which bears on economic transaction in marriage and residence patterns. The default among African foraging groups is bride service, initially matrilocal. It's standard for a son-in-law to live for several years with his wife and her parents. A woman's first and perhaps second child is likely to be born where her mother is. Work in population genetics is now showing a distinct matrilocal bias, evident in the localization of mother to daughter mtDNA lineages compared to father to son Y lineages. So there's a focus on matrilocality. This is the diametric opposite of the finding in neighboring Bantu farming and pastoralist populations, and it involves long timescales. A similar tendency for female relatives to stay together is found in Hadza longitudinal resonance data. So she's just proposing to extend on what Grauer was talking about by focusing on cosmology and religion, but she's also bringing in some data relating to, quote, economic transaction in marriage and residence patterns, focusing on matrilocality. So people living basically where their mother's line is. Okay. So that was the first section, which is really outlining where she's going to go. That was called a hypothetical baseline culture. And the second section is called a lunar template. And it goes as follows. Turning now to cosmology, one core feature shared among these groups can be suggested immediately. The moon, as it oscillates between phases, figures prominently. Lunar cosmology is widespread in Khoisan traditions. A story found among almost all Khoisan groups, the moon and hare, relates the origins of death. Among widespread Bushman groups, the waning moon is linked to spirits of the dead, and the new moon to new life. Such potent entities as the trickster and eland are identifiably lunar. They grow large, fade away, and come back alive. Moon phases, notably the appearance of the new moon, schedule menarcheal ritual and prayers. Menarcheal as in relating to the first menstruation. Apologies for not knowing that word already, but so it said moon phases, notably the appearance of the new moon, schedule menarcheal ritual and prayers for hunting luck, and have the power of cooling arrow poison. While the new and waxing moon is associated with hunger and hunting, the fat full moon signifies repletion and feasting. So basically, in this section, we go into all the symbolism and traditions in these different groups that are associated with the moon to show its commonality or shared significance. So it's a little tricky to follow. So she goes on, as Dear Quain told Lucy Lloyd, quote, our mothers spoke. They said, wait, we must watch because this moon is a thing like this. We must see if our men will not get a tortoise, for it is a thing that knows the time at which we shall get food. So that's a quote from an informant pointing to the significance of the moon in their culture, the agency of the moon. It says, the time of hunger may be linked among the Sioux to menarche at dark moon when campfires are extinguished, which is a motif echoed in several anti-cooking narratives among southern Bushman groups. So that was about the Khoisan traditions and their connections with the moon. Again, there's a whole lot of references through here that I'm not reading out. So I'm going to go into this second paragraph and then I'm going to skip to the conclusions because I don't want to be held up with this for too long. So the second paragraph goes, while the Hadza lack such riches of lore about the moon, their primary ritual, Ipime, can only be danced at night when no moon is in the sky. For them, the moon is brother to all women. This compares to Naharo Bushman law. Quote, he doesn't like the boys, just the girls, that being the moon. And for the Western Pygmy Bayaka, woman's biggest husband is the moon. And so when the Malobe ritual is called on in a night of no moon, it leads to a special, intense, and aesthetic experience. Just as in Ipime, a different primary ritual, campfires are extinguished, so the singing group, largely women, sit in complete moonless dark. They may hold mystical conversations with the moon, and they're singing lures luminescent forest spirits to dance around them, which, as at Epime, are secretly engendered by male initiates. Yeah, so essentially what she's drawing here is this connection between the way that the moon is regarded as an agent that has spiritual power and ritual practice and use of singing music in connection with religious experience. Okay, so her conclusions in that section go as follows. I propose that lunar time is the structuring or dialectical framework for the relationships between or these various and ambiguous powers. So essentially, she was talking about different kinds of gods, different creator or trickster figures in different groups that are associated with spiritual power and can be invoked or honored ritually, and that lunar time, the cycling of the moon, is a key variable in ancient forms of religious communion, communion with deity that structured ancient cosmologies. Which is so what she's saying is, again, I propose that lunar time is the structuring or dialectical framework for the relationships between these various or ambiguous powers. She says, structuralists like Levi-Strauss and De Huche arrived at markedly similar outlines of an invariant syntax revolving around certain hard relations of identity and opposition, persisting through all ideological manipulation. So she gives different pairs of opposites to illustrate this, which is what she refers to as invariant syntax. The categories offered are celestial fire versus cooking fire, noise versus cooking, blood versus fire, incest versus marriage, sky versus earth, and bitter moon versus honeymoon. So this idea is that the branch or style of anthropology called structuralist arrived at kind of similar outlines of a kind of invariant sort of cultural syntax, which revolves around certain key oppositions, such as the ones that we just mentioned, that somehow he connected with. It's a, yeah, this idea is that the lunar time structures the dialectical framework for these relationships. Hoping that she's going to explain this in the following paragraph, which says, Levi-Strauss was ambiguous as to what such structures represented. By the end of Mythologics, he saw these as emergent properties of the human mind in its tendency to classify and create logical relations, devoid of specific content. De Huys recognized in the logical transformations of Lunda, Luba, and Kuba royal epic cycles an ideological function of validation of the divine kingship, but saw that these rested on an anthropo-cosmogonic discourse, manifestly antecedent to such historic development. Okay, so that just brought up more questions. So she goes on, following structuralist method, but locating it within his evolutionary model of a Paleolithic or Middle Stone Age sex strike, Chris Knight generated a time-resistant syntax as a dynamic oscillation between ritual power switched on and off in relation to the waxing or waning moon. All these structuralists concur in the prominence of a lunar function in the syntax of myth, but Knight offers a material cause. Given the excellent night vision of big cats and other predators, the impact of lunar periodicity in hominin evolutionary ecology must be of key importance for our emergence on the African savanna, stretching back millions of years before any symbolic culture. The moon and its phases have a critical material effect on predator and prey interactions. So that lunar framework provides the matrix within which the earliest cosmological structures were embedded. Recurrent among those African hunting cultures are links between the phase of dark moon, menstruation, hunger, and the extinction of cooking fire. Yeah, so the idea is that natural, sort of, yeah, quote unquote natural hunting and gathering behavior is tied to the cycle of the moon because everyone can see better at night. And that might give different reasons for going out to hunt at that time, or in fact hunting at a different time because of the night vision of other predators. And so this is this observance that the cycles of the moon are deeply tied to when and why different rituals and different practices like hunting might occur. And this is why this lunar cycling is featuring so prominently in relation to cycles of ritual power, and is featuring so prominently is in cosmology. Okay, I'm going to move on. The next section is quite short. So we've done the first two sections of her conclusion, which were about, yeah, the first one, the source cosmology was lunar and menstrual, in that ritual and practice around menstruation manifestly affected relationships between women, men, and the animals they hunted. Processes of production and reproduction were intertwined, and showed this metaphoric equivalence. To menstruate is to shoot a poisoned arrow, to give birth is to kill large game. This conforms to the lunar and menstrual character of the invariant syntax of myth described by Levi-Strauss. Okay, the next section, which hopefully makes a little bit more sense. Healing dances. As Grauer notes, all these hunter-gatherer populations engage in healing or medicine dances. These may lead to ecstatic experiences, as healers summon or come into contact with spirits, more or less nebulous ancestors, rather than personified or named figures. Such rituals rest on polyphonic singing performance. In most traditions, both genders participate, although certain rituals may be single sex, but the collective of women as singers are generally major contributors. The classic example is the community healing dance of the Jew Huanxi, representing a more widespread Bushman tradition. Katz and colleagues stress the synergic communal effort allied to individual painful experience of summoning Nom, energy or potency, to enter Aya, transcendent or enhanced awareness. Keeney, by contrast, avoids reference to trance states, highlighting instead the dynamic, transformative aspects of shamanic bodily and emotional arousal, becoming interconnected through all senses. Chris Lowe emphasizes the role of sensory stimuli, especially smell, and mechanisms of stress applied to the body of a dancer. It's quite interesting. So it goes on. Lewis, 2002, compares the trance-like experiences of Yaka, Mukondi Masana, especially where performances last for hours or even days. He describes euphoria, a dreamy, heightened experience, and appreciation of sound and movement, charging people with irrepressible energy to sing and dance. So these are aesthetic, atmospheric, multimedia sensory creations for bringing joy to the community. Even where male initiates are the spirit controllers, the women's mood, energy, and performance are vital for luring and seducing the capricious spirits. For the Mubuti, Molimo, most famously described by Turnbull, is created and performed by male initiates. This is the dance that they do, as they summon the quote, great animal of the forest, using light and sound effects in the darkness, using a bamboo trumpet or even a drain pipe. When singing the great Molimo songs, says Turnbull, quote, the pygmy is quite plainly in another world, staring into the fire or up at the treetops, communing with a power which he believes to exist in the forest. It goes on later. Among the Hadza, the dark moon ceremony Epime is again supposedly male governed, yet there can be no performance without enough women prepared to sing through the cold night. It is when women are moved to euphoric collective dancing, swirling close around but not touching the single male spirit dancer, that participants approach enchantment beneath the stars. Epime is both a general community medicine dance for well-being and forthcoming success in the hunt, as well as a context for healing techniques to be applied to sick individuals. So that was a bit about these different healing dances that are quite common to these different hunter-gatherer populations. The next section goes into initiation and gender polarity. So this had to do with the phenomena that we saw in relation to ritual, where one's identity essentially reverses from a, for example, um, available female human to an unavailable male animal. So the section is called, and like why? Why did that happen? Why was that interesting? Why was that useful to these groups? So it says the section is called Return to First Creation, Initiation and Gender Polarity. The remarkable ethnography of the Keenies, working with Nye Nye Juhuan healers, has revealed the frame of healing as seeking re-entry to first creation, original time, before time and place. when nothing was named or fixed in form. Everything kept changing. There was no death or sickness, and people had eland heads. So this is a kind of mystical participation or shared religious experience, which is connected with healing, particularly. Then she talks about the trickster, as in a trickster god. So trickster, inhabiting the western sky as the new moon and spirits of the dead, is gatekeeper of this inchoate world in perpetual flux, central denizen of the first order of existence. And so puberty rites, storytelling, and healing dances all serve in the hunt for nom, which is energy or potency, where the first and second and third appearance of a girl's menstrual blood is interpreted as an opening to first creation. She now exists inside first creation, constantly changing her form, and this fills her with strong nom, energy or potency. The powerful charge of her presence in first creation requires careful ritual precaution to ensure nobody is left behind. All the community need to move through the door with her. To do this, they dance naked, as in first creation, no one wore clothes. They dance as eland, since the ancestors had eland heads. The girl now can change form to become an old woman, a man, a boy, an animal, or hybrid, and so too can all those inside the dance. To make everyone more like the girl, an elder gnome, a kind of elder shaman figure, makes small cuts in each person's ear so they bleed. This results in blood dropping to the ground and deepening their entry and identity with the girl. The great danger is that the girl can become a strong male hunter, while a man becomes an eland, and she can then hunt and kill him. So long as everybody bleeds together, they're all changing together, and this affects the border crossing into first creation. A boy's initiation, connected to first kill, will have the same structure. He is made to bleed with cuts to the forehead. Everyone must bleed, so they have no fear of his strong gnome, his strong energy, and changing. Wow, so there was so much just presented in that paragraph. It basically focused on the um, spiritual, uh, like magical religious power of a girl's first menstruation, where this was conceived as a manifestation of the kind of spiritual power that shamanic training is designed to produce. So people who are not directly initiated by nature in this way train for years to gain this kind of skill, whereas they regard that this is sort of automatically given to a girl upon first menstruation, and that this opens a kind of ritual portal that the whole community can participate in this um, a healing dance, a collective healing dance, a shared ritual designed to return them to quote original time, which is essentially a um, religious experience, a shared religious experience in which they return to the origins of what they call first creation. So I'm going to give one more paragraph here. For the other African hunter-gatherer populations, we can find significant evidence in initiation rituals of reenactments of original scenarios, which could be understood as versions of first creation. These also involve aspects of gender reversal. Notably, the male initiation societies among the Hadza, Mubuti, and Yaka all recount matriarchy myths of the original ownership of women. That's ownership by women. In the ritual practice of these societies, and particularly in the corresponding female initiation groups, we find reenactment of women's primacy, entailing mutability of gender and or species. I think that will do. This is basically like the origins of matriarchy in these different groups. Has to do with their ritual practice, and particularly has to do with like the way that they do initiations. that involve a quote reenactment of women's primacy, which involves mutability of their gender and or their species. So it's like in these ceremonies, they can ritually change their gender, change their species to become like an animal, as if they're an animal. I'm going to move on though, because I don't want this to take all day. I'm going to go to the next section, and I'm hoping that it will explain itself. It's called Animal de Passage. It has to do with this figure of the trickster and the eland. So it goes. Lewis Williams' original conception in Believing and Seeing, which is a book, of a shared structure governing Bushman female and male initiation and the healing rituals is surely validated by the Keeney's ethnography. He drew together 19th century and Zam Southern Cape Bushman ethnography of the Bleak and Lloyd collection with Kalahari fieldwork on contemporary Juhoansi to eliminate rock art across southern Africa. Is a complicated sentence. Subsequently, an emphasis on healing experience as the primary symbolic work led to a bandwagon effect of all enigmatic images being ascribed to trance, with less attention paid to initiation context. So what she's doing is saying, hey, let's pay attention to initiation here. Um, some scholars, notably Anne Solomon, continued to point to stories of initiation as providing significant insight into interpretations of rock art. The narratives concerning first creation of the Nyenye elder Kuntabu, a main informant for both Beasley and the Keeneys, gives us a much clearer perspective on this debate. Any attempt to counterpose healing and initiation misses a fundamental aspect of Bushman representation for supernatural potency. Whether belonging to a healer or a menarcheal girl, a first kill hunter or a storyteller, it's the same potency, fueling re-entry into first creation when people had eland heads. Again, this is what I was saying before. It's the same kind of energy or potency that is um, whether it belongs to a healer or a menarcheal girl, a first kill hunter, or a storyteller. It's the same potency that fuels the re-entry of the group into first creation. So where each one of these kinds of people at a different time may be the source of this communal re-entry into mythical time. Let me continue for a bit here. It says, Lewis Williams evocatively described the eland bull as the animal de passage of Bushman initiations. Healers and initiates identify powerfully with the eland as it fattens, is shot with a poisoned arrow, dies, is consumed, or fades away. As she shapeshifts, the Juhuan maiden has both shot an eland and is herself the fattening bull eland. In first creation, the eland-headed people had hooves that made the sound of clapping, sounds invoked in the initiation and healing dances. And these become the first known energy or power, energy or potency. Okay, so this basic idea is that there's a the identification with this particular animal is associated with their initiation rituals. But then it basically goes into like a list of or a description of all the different qualities of this particular animal, the eland, that associate it with um, this like ritual significance. Like as an example, um, for example, the ideal Ipime animal or ritual animal, the eland offers a motif of reversal. Nocturnal hunting is usually only possible towards full moon, except in a unique case of the eland. This idea that it can be hunted at times which are not the full moon. So this is some of the reasons why it might have this significance. It then ends up being associated with The trickster with the moon, with lightning, with rain, with fertility, and with horns. For example, Thomas observes that antelopes like the eland will watch the sky for lightning, since wildfires will burn off dry grass and produce new growth. And human hunters would have learned to exploit this, deliberately burning off grass to attract game. This might have to do with the origins of this ritual magic. So I'm going to leave that there. I have two more sections to do before we get to the shared structures that they have. The first one is called The Ideology of Blood, and I found this pretty interesting, so I'm going to read it. Quote, parallel to the trickster's role as guardian and creator of the great game antelopes is the trickster's jealous guardianship of maidens at first menstruation. The counterpart to, so Kagan, it talks about Kagan and Kwa, which is a snake, which had names for this different rain bull or rain eland. So there's a connection between this eland and the rain, as we saw talking about, associated with lightning, and it gets named as a deity in different ways, among them Kagan and Kwa. Complicated, but anyway. So as it said, parallel to the trickster's role as guardian and creator of the great game antelopes is the trickster's jealous guardianship of maidens at first menstruation. The counterpart to Gagan among the Xam, the male rain bull, or snake Kwa, would be roused to wrath by any failure in the menarcheal observances. Zam informants stressed the odor of the girl as what attracted Kwa. The maiden could only come in very guarded contact with water, but had to paint the young men of the band with hematite stripes like a zebra to protect them from Kwa's lightning. Violations caused the utmost social calamity. Culture itself unraveled. Skin bags reverted to raw form as game animals, while the girl and her kin were transformed into frogs, the rain's creatures. So basically, this figure, this trickster figure, is a guardian not only of the game but also of maidens at first menstruation. It goes on. This is a particular example of a basic principle found in all these hunter-gatherer groups. Everywhere we find mystical intertwining of production, hunting, with reproduction, menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth. Intertwining of production and reproduction, hunting with menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth. This amounts to an ideology of blood. Two forms, menstrual blood on the one hand and the blood of game on the other, must never be allowed to mix. And so Chris Knight was talking about this in the episode on ritual about this original analogy between animal blood and menstrual blood as the kind of original as if metaphorical leap that humans made to begin, uh, like the origins of taboo and sacredness had to do with this, drawing from Durkheim. Yeah, so this amounts to an ideology of blood. Two forms, menstrual blood on the one hand and the blood of game on the other, must never be allowed to mix. As in the stories of Kwa, the idiom is one of smell arousing anger. So game animals would be able to smell whether a hunter had sex with his wife, and offended will flee. Worse still, they would be able to smell that he had sex when she was menstruating, and this would provoke the animal to attack, turning the hunter into the hunted. While animals may be jealous and insist on being wooed by hunters in apparent opposition to women, girls at first menstruation are also hunters who shoot animals. In Juhuan idiom, quote, she has shot an eland, while she is also an eland in the constant shapeshifting of first creation. What does this mean? I think this is like what I would connect here is this idea that there's a significance of this time of first menstruation, and in such a like a ritual event, this girl has an opportunity to capture a certain spirit, which they conceive as shooting an eland, but in a ritualistic way. And this is connected with not only capturing that spirit, but also becoming that spirit. So it's connected with this shape-shifting idea. So the idea would be, I would connect that I would connect that through Jung, one's soul, anima or animus, is usually of the opposite gender. So there's a way that this young female uh, girl at first menstruation, she in this mythico-religious ritual practice assumes the identity of her soul and shoots or captures an animal spirit in this ritual space. And the effect of that is that she can take on its identity. She can become it in that shape-shifting space. And so this theriomorphism, becoming like the animal, is connected to the hunting prowess um of the girl. And because it's in first creation, they were saying their ancestors have the heads of eland. So it's like the way that they become like the animals is connected with their return to first creation. Yeah, so it says we can propose a fundamental structure of equivalences shared by those bow and poisoned arrow hunters. A menstrual woman is as a hunter who has shot game, while a woman who gives birth is as a hunter who kills game. So they're kind of equivalent in some way. The most elaborate example of hunter-gatherer magical interrelation of production and reproduction is Aquila, documented in detail by Jeremy Lewis among the Yaka Mbengele. Lewis notes that numerous linguistically diverse Western pygmy groups have Aquila practices, while Eastern pygmy groups like Mbuti and Ife share the concepts and practices under different names. This implies that the complex is of considerable antiquity. Aquila invokes a polysemic cluster revolving around menstruation, blood, taboo, a hunter's meat, good hunting luck, the power of animals to harm humans, and particular dangers to human reproduction, human production, and human health and sanity. The core metaphorical equivalences of Aquila equate men killing animals and women birthing children. They also equate the spearing of animals and the penetration of women's bodies in intercourse, and also menstrual blood with the blood of the hunt. Differing experience of Aquila by sex, and to some extent age, is the basic organizer of gender roles and relations. A senior hunter informed Lewis that his Aquila was big, very big, since he slept alone on a mat without his wife. To mix Aquila with lots of people causes a hunter's luck to be ruined, creates problems for a woman in childbirth, and affects her infant's health. Women have Aquila too, the informant continues. A woman's Aquila is with the moon. When a woman is Aquila, menstruating, her husband takes her smell, and so he doesn't go hunting or walking in the forest with friends. Animals flee when they smell a woman's Aquila, ritual danger. The animals smell him, the animals smell her on him. Okay, again, that was kind of complicated, but it was quite interesting. And for me, the association is pretty clear. It had to do with the ideology of blood. So the final section, before I restate the conclusions, is called Structures Shared Beyond Hunter-Gatherers. Shared structures found among African hunting populations, separated over long periods of time, are likely to be ancient, and may provide evidence about early symbolic cosmologies of modern humans dating back to the Middle Stone Age. Structures identified here as potentially archaic can also be identified in African cultures where hunting no longer predominates, whether they be farmers or pastoralists. It's beyond the scope of this chapter to extend comparisons to Bantu, Nilotic, or other language groups, but a few points can be made as to how this affects my argument. In terms of politics, economics, and subsistence technologies, hunter-gatherers clearly offer the greatest continuity to Middle Stone Age populations. So by examining hunter-gatherer ritual, myth, taboos, and beliefs, we can gain insights into extremely conservative and stable symbolic complexes. I'm going to say that again. By examining hunter-gatherer ritual, myth, taboos, and beliefs, we can gain insight into extremely conservative and stable symbolic complexes. It's not surprising if those complexes will be retained in derivative forms in the cultures of groups who are no longer nomadic hunter-gatherers. Historic material change in subsistence, sorry, Historic material change in subsistence is likely to affect the ways those ideologies are manipulated and transformed, yet the core ingredients of ritual power are unlikely to alter. And specifically, there were a couple of different categories that were shared. Male production was associated with hunting, that was connected with the sacredness of the blood of animals, and also the practice of respect for women was connected with the practice of respect for the animals, where if um, male hunters did not sort of conserve their energy by not sleeping around, then their hunting energy, their hunting prowess would be grossly diminished because the animals would know. And conversely, female production or reproduction was connected with birthing, with menstruation, pregnancy, and birthing. And there was a sacredness and taboo associated with menstrual blood, and also paradoxically with respect for the animals, because if it was talking in in the essay on ritual about how if women, especially women who are pregnant, did not have respect for animals that were hunted, then their baby would be born deformed. And so kind of this taboo or sacred association between blood and menstruation runs deeper. It's about male production and female reproduction and the effects of proper respect for nature itself, natural processes. And then finally, there was a connection between the oscillation of the moon and the ritual reversal of identity. So when the moon would go through its rhythmic phases, this would occasion moments of ritual participation in original time. And that was connected with, obviously, with collective ritual activity, but then also reversal of identity. So through the um, spiritual energy or gnome associated with healing, with trance, with dancing, but also with first menstruation, the initiate would be able to reverse their normal identity, for example, from female available human to unavailable male animal. And then that would be essential in their participation in original time, which had to do with healing and the renewal of their cultural identity. Yeah, and it was also connected with um, sort of spiritual prowess, which was connected with hunting prowess. So this capacity to um, become like the animal was connected with the I would say soul's capacity to hunt the spirit of the animal and capture it and thereby become it. So she gives one more paragraph here, which says, so I'm just going to restate what she was just saying. Yeah, in terms of politics, economics, and subsistence technologies, hunter-gatherers clearly offer the greatest continuity to Middle Stone Age populations. And so by examining hunter-gatherer ritual, myth, taboos, and beliefs, we can gain insight into extremely conservative and stable symbolic complexes. And it's not surprising if those complexes will be retained in derivative forms in the cultures of groups who are no longer nomadic hunter-gatherers. Historic material change in subsistence is likely to affect the ways these ideologies are manipulated and transformed, yet the core ingredients of ritual power are unlikely to alter. An example is found in Dishu's analysis of the central Bantu myths of kingship, which, as he noted, entailed anthropo-cosmogonic discourse much older than the divine kings. Specifically, he equated rainbow snake entities to menstrual and incestuous ritual queens as signifiers of permanence, threatening the periodicity of the wet and dry seasons. We can expect a switch of emphasis from lunar to seasonal cycles, while still correlating with archaic waxing and waning metaphors. Menstruation becomes opposed to rain and fertility, and identified with sterility. This can be understood in terms of a shift of gender politics in relation to new and more permanent forms of marriage by bride price, as against hunter-gatherer bride service. For hunters, menstruation belongs to categories of transformative potency like Aquila and Nom, while for farmers and cattle people, it becomes a source of pollution and ill omen. Its power and centrality to ritual remains. So essentially, she was just talking about how this symbolic complex changes when the way of life changes from hunter-gatherer to farming. And it talks about how the significance of menstruation changes, but that it retains its central ritual power. For example, from lunar cycles to seasonal cycles. Again, I'm now going to restate the conclusions. While this is a preliminary and cursory attempt at comparative ethnography, a few conclusions can be drawn about the source African cosmology. A. It was lunar and menstrual, in that ritual and practice around menstruation manifestly affected relationships between women, men, and the animals they hunted. Processes of production and reproduction were intertwined and showed this metaphoric equivalence. To menstruate is to shoot a poisoned arrow, and to give birth is to kill large game. And this conforms to the lunar menstrual character of the invariant syntax of myth described by Lévi-Strauss. B. Healing and spirit dances involve polyphonic singing performance, largely of female choruses, leading to euphoric or trance experiences through rhythmic repetition of sound and movement, invoking nebulous spirits of the dead or the forest. C. The potency of shamans or spirit dancers and menstrual maidens was one and the same power, capable of carrying the community into first creation. Gendered initiation groups represented origin scenarios through the reversal of sexual attributes and/or species mutability. These motifs of reversal coincided with the switch of lunar phases and oscillation between taboo and relaxation of taboo. A dynamic of reverse dominance allowed each gender group, but especially women, to assert egalitarian relations and mutual interdependency. And finally, D. Large-horned antelope, like eland, supplied metaphors of transformation in initiation and healing dances, again predicated on the waxing and waning of the moon. The guardians and creators of these animals de passage imposed respect rules for all game. That was a section I didn't talk about. And these were effective supernatural sanctions governing the proper sharing of flesh, human and animal. And so finally, Camilla Power concludes, there appear to be a genuine and non-trivial shared structures of ritual and belief among African hunter-gatherers that are likely to be very archaic. Those structures can be regarded as data that constrain possible models of human symbolic origins. Any model for the symbolic cultural origins of modern humans should not only address evidence in the archaeological record, but also pay attention to structures of a possible source cosmology of equivalent antiquity. So the idea is that these elements, although they're not going to be expressed in exactly the same way in all cultures, obviously, because there's incredible variation, there is significant evidence of some similarity, and that these similarities might be of extremely ancient origin, and therefore point to a shared source of what human culture was about. We can clearly see this here in terms of the healing power of singing and dancing, um, the importance of collective ritual activity, the significance of menstruation, the importance of being able to turn into an animal, so pretending as if one is an animal, the connection with male and female forms of reproduction, with the cycles of the moon, with the respect rules imposed upon game animals, regulating hunting behavior, and obviously the importance of like ritual transformation of identity into the opposite of what one's identity normally is. Yeah, that structured practices for sharing. Okay, so that was, again, that essay was called Reconstructing a Source Cosmology for African Hunter-Gatherers by Camilla Power. So thank you, Camilla. And what I'm gonna move into is the summary, which is very helpfully provided by Alan. No, it's not Alan Watts. It's a different Watts. It's Ian Watts. And he gives basically a summary of everything that we've talked about over the last couple of episodes in this series, at the same time as discussing the connection between serpents, like rainbow serpents, and the eland that we were talking about. So there's a kind of common symbolic category that might be not just through Africa, but common between Africa and Australia. And that's what I'm going to talk about next time.